As we mentioned last week, there are 3 different kinds of episodes for Reconstruct. The first kind, like the last episode with Peter Enns, is where we bring on a guest and we pursue some topic with them that they know a lot about. So that's the first kind of episode. The second kind of episode also would include a guest, but it's where we hear them tell their story of deconstruction and reconstruction. An example of that is the upcoming Science Mike McHarg episode. And the third kind of episode is where John and I each take a whack at the same question. The hope is that we give 2 distinct options for how to answer a really difficult question. We interview each other and ask each other for clarity, and we do a little bit of debate. Neither of us believe that our particular answer to any difficult question is the only available answer for a Christ follower to hold.
Hey guys, I have a question I've been trying to answer for a long time, and I'd like to hear your perspectives. In your view, how much and what exactly does someone need to believe to be saved? Thanks so much for all your work.
Okay, so here we go. In order to answer this, we got to talk about what we mean both by believe and saved.
Nice.
Let me just give you an answer to this question that I was raised with that I no longer believe to be exhaustively true, and there's parts of it I don't believe at all. So here's an old answer. As a result of Adam and Eve's sin, humans are all born as enemies of God, unable to be in his holy presence. Jesus came to die for everyone's sins, and anyone who believes that Jesus did this receives the perfect righteousness of Jesus. Once they have this righteousness, they can now be in God's presence and are saved. Those who are saved during their lifetimes go to heaven when they die, and those who are not saved during their lifetimes go to hell.
Right. So you don't disagree with every portion of this, but
Right.
the entire narrative as a whole is something you just can't.
I don't buy the whole thing. Specifically, people are born as enemies of God as a result of Adam and Eve's sin is the part that is like the least convincing to me in there. I do believe that Christ's sacrifice is in some sort of way an atonement for sin, but I think that I am way more likely to believe that the sacrificial language in the Bible is metaphorical, as opposed to believing that like there is some real metaphysical, actually existing debt that has to be paid before a human being could be with God. That part seems really weird to me.
Sure.
Basically. So then what do I believe? Okay. Currently, I don't think I can say very much about what happens when we die, although I do have a lot of hope because I have a very strong sense that increases daily, I would say, that the God of the universe is fundamentally loving.
Yeah.
And that's the hope I rest in. And when it comes to whatever happens after I am conscious on earth, I just trust that it will be just and loving. So maybe that means nothing, and that's perfectly just, but I don't have a hard time believing the biblical story that there is something more and beautiful, because the glimpses I get of God while living are so beautiful as to suggest, man, if I could have a more unfettered access to God, how incredible might that be?
Yeah.
Now, I hope that all of God's creatures eventually experience that, meaning I hope that everybody is saved, but I don't know that they are. So for the sake of conversation, let's assume that there are 2 camps, that the sheep and the goats in Jesus' parable map exactly onto those who are saved and those who are not saved. In fact, that language in the Bible is the hardest for me, this kind of binary language of judgment. Now, I can't say for sure if that is a historical future event or if it is like a way that Jesus and other writers use the language of their day to communicate seriousness, right? So you imagine Jesus talking about being thrown into Gehenna being an actual burning trash pit outside of Jerusalem.
Right.
Using that kind of apocalyptic language and imagery is like saying, look, this is really serious stuff. It is so serious that not following it is like being thrown into Gehenna.
Right.
So that's one option. That'd be sort of my progressive liberal hope, is that the language about hell and judgment in the Bible is metaphor to say really serious and really true things. But I have to at least allow for the possibility that, in fact, there is a binary judgment and some people aren't saved.
Right.
And to not do so, I think, would be overly optimistic, and also the evidence does not warrant confidence in being able to say that, meaning the biblical evidence. Number 2, to keep in mind, there's different salvation accounts given throughout the New Testament. Believe in your heart and confess with your mouth.
Right.
Jesus answers someone who asks, how can I have eternal life? Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do this and you shall live. In both Jesus and Paul, there are entire households. So both in the Gospels and in Acts, there are entire households that are saved through the faith of one individual. The idea here just being, look, resist a tidy definition of what salvation means, because the Bible resists a tidy definition itself. Third thing to keep in mind, the word belief in Paul's day is not the same as our word belief today.
Right.
When we say belief, we mean it exclusively as a propositional statements. I believe it will rain later today.
Yeah. A mental state affirmative of a proposition is belief.
Exactly. And that's just not what that word meant back then. It included beliefs, like we would say today, but it also was trust. And I think that trust is a better English word than belief. So if we want to rephrase that thing, if you trust in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you'll be saved, is actually a more literal rendering than if you believe in your heart.
Yeah. I mean, you see the problem of rendering this in the English, actually.
Right.
Because you have the Greek verb and the cognate noun, pistio and pistis, that both maintain this idea of commitment and trust and faithfulness in some actual object rather than just mental assent. But then in English, when it's the verb, we render it believe. When it's a noun, we render it faith.
Right. So I like to think of this more like as faithfulness, like somebody who is faithful to Christ. And I think once you start thinking of it that way, I do think that for me, the belief aspect of faithfulness takes a back seat. And I think when you look at in the book of Hebrews, for instance, the Hall of Fame of Faith, those characters that are mentioned are people who, with their actions, remained faithful to God. And that is why they make it into that list, not so much because they believed the right things. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So full circle back to the question, what must one believe to be saved? I don't know. It seems like there are many ways to be saved. And probably the modern understanding of the word belief has very little to do with it. To my mind, it has more to do with trusting God, living faithfully as a Christ follower. And belief, even in the modern sense, is of course a part of trusting God and living faithfully. If you trust God, then certainly you also believe that God is worth trusting. Can't have it without that.
Right.
But it isn't the belief itself. And as we read in the Gospels, even the demons believe in God.
Wow, it's crazy how similar we can be when we really boil it down. I love it. Like, I think the trust you have in the real God will always be accompanied by certain beliefs, which you're ready to say, but beliefs don't get you all the way.
Yeah, I'm saying, but I'm going further and saying I'm perfectly comfortable with someone trusting in the real God and ending up with beliefs that are wrong because of their own upbringing and rubric or what seems reasonable to them that they don't have control over. Yeah. That's where we do differ.
Yeah.
So my own experience of God is just not that verbal. It's not very language specific. Like sometimes, I mean, there's no way to experience anything that's not through language.
Exactly.
But what I mean to say is like the most profound experiences of God that I believe I've had have been pretty devoid of language content. They tend to be like a surge of joy or whatever. Even when I ask God for something specific that language is required for, the most common way that I think that he communicates with me is through just joy at a particular piece of language, a thought or a word,
right,
or whatever. But it's not like, I almost never get the sense of like, here is the right way to think about things, Dan.
Right. So, you don't get, when you say it's not language specific, it's not as though you don't have language through which you mediate your experience. Of course, on your end, you use language to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But you're saying whoever God is, he doesn't speak to you all the time.
Yeah,
the language doesn't emanate from him.
God loves me far more often than he speaks to me. So one way of saying it.
Right.
Now, if I imagine, it's very easy for me to imagine that someone of another faith has a similar experience. I mean, there's all kinds of writings about this, right? In other faith traditions.
Feeling generating, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if that person had the exact experience I had, they would have their own linguistic context for it. And I assume that they would be just as confident as I am that that was the real God who gave them that love or that joy or whatever that experience was. So how could we possibly settle this dispute if we're going to say that this self-communication of God through direct interaction with an individual is primary? So I'm kind of assuming that, because in my experience, it just does seem primary. It seems much more primary than any particular doctrine or any particular systematic theology I've ever learned or hermeneutic for how to read scripture. This direct experience of God's love just does seem primary to me.
Yeah.
So if you accept that it's primary, and then I and person B have the same experience of a loving God, yet we live in different linguistic frameworks and different religious societal settings.
That's fine, yeah.
How can we settle the dispute of whose interaction is more real than the other's interaction, or whose words about God, whose linguistic framework is more correct than the other person's linguistic framework? How do we settle that?
Faith, belief, the trust that one has in God is never a general religious feeling. To say the entire experience or trust of God has to hinge upon just one transient momentary experience, maybe that can be part of it. Maybe it can be confusing. I totally understand, but I don't know if I'd be willing to hinge everything on that. Or from the identity there, say any conception henceforth afterwards must be fundamentally identical.
Well, right. So I'm not saying
your
either
wife
of those
could
things.
generate feelings of love,
Sure,
the same way my wife could. We can have the same sort of experience.
I'm
you
not.
know what I'm saying?
I don't think I'm making either of those claims. First of all, I'm not saying that everything hinges on the personal experience, because you could be schizophrenic, right, and have crazy experiences. And so, sometimes I really do check myself to make sure that I'm not just generating. Am I just generating happy feelings for myself? I worry because I don't want to just delude myself into sort of like a Marxist opiate for the masses or whatever. You know, I don't want to be someone who does that. So I am kind of keeping a reality check on myself.
Well, then how do you play off your feelings against anything else? I mean, how do you know your feeling is the Christian God, not any other God? How does that happen to you?
Right. This is the question. So that's why I keep talking so much about the fundamental center of the universe is self-giving love, because so much of my experience of God, if I had to put it into a concept, comes down to that concept. So I'll give an example. If I go to Mass, a Catholic church, if I take the water on my finger and I do the sign of the cross as I enter the building or leave the building, okay? What does that mean? That means I'm reminding myself of my baptism into Christ's death. What does that mean? Well, what that means is, so what I really end up thinking about is I'm doing the cross and I'm thinking, you're the self-giving, self-sacrificing God.
Yeah.
You willingly died. I am joining you in that. So I have a belief. Jesus of Nazareth died and rose again. I have another belief. Christians get baptized as a way of participating in Christ's death and resurrection. Then I have another belief. When I do this ritual, what do I actually think, though? I don't think about those beliefs. I get down to that core principle of this is the center of things. I am reminding myself that this is the center of all things, and I am trying to participate in that actively.
Yeah.
So I cannot separate this personal experience I have of God from my Christian rubric, but neither could a Hindu separate his experience of God from his Hindu rubric. And my point is just, I think we have two choices here, broadly speaking. We can either prioritize the experience of God and God's love, or we can prioritize the rational experience or thought systems that identify beliefs as different from each other and build systems. And what I'm saying is I feel more comfortable with the former.
Do you not like the idea of saying they're both parts of a relationship?
I think they are both parts, but I think you have to subsume the loving experience of God into the theoretical if you want to delineate lines. That's my gut feeling. I could be wrong on that, but that's kind of my feeling is you have to take the beliefs and prioritize them over the experience of God.
Yeah, I would just say for consistency, you would just need both.
Okay. So
and
maybe
if one is missing, or if one category is diametrically opposed to what you know is true, then it just isn't the same thing.
So, okay, let's talk about diametrically opposed. So this is where this is kind of where I'm going. So I have an example here, an example from my own life, and then a thought experiment of someone else's life. Okay. So recently I had a thing for which I needed to ask God for courage.
Mm-hmm.
And I was praying and I said, God, please give me courage. Or I said, tell me that I shouldn't do this thing. Right? I was like, either give me the courage to do it because it's hard, or maybe show me some sign that I shouldn't do it. And every time I landed on the word courage, that's when I felt God communicating to me. I felt he flooded me with this joy. I don't want to talk about it too much, just enough to get the point across of like, he gave me courage. Okay. Now imagine it's the 60s and there is a black young Muslim man who has driven to Selma and they're about to walk across the bridge with MLK, and they know there are these white police officers and there are people there with rocks and knives and maybe guns. And he's praying, he's doing his 5 a.m. morning prayer, and he says, God, give me courage or tell me I don't need to do this. And when he asks for courage...
And you're saying the point is he isn't a Christian.
He's not a Christian. He's a Muslim, okay? But that morning, he prays and he says, give me courage or tell me I don't have to do this, that it's the wrong move. And when he asks for courage, he gets courage. And then he gets up and he goes and he walks across the bridge in Selma, right? Imagine this. Who am I to say that their experience of God is different than what mine was? If they asked for the same thing that I asked for, they received the same thing that then allowed them to take part in an action that is obviously a loving and just action.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I can say, well, because you wouldn't identify Jesus as the Christ, that you're not experiencing a relationship with the real God. Now, you could say, well, common grace, you've experienced some good thing in the world. But I would say, God give me courage, God gives courage is a relationship. And so if that man has a relationship in that moment, how can I invalidate that?
Yeah, if you're right in the assumption that he did receive courage and God gave it to him, the discussion's over. God gave it to him. That's fine. That's sort of the very question at hand, though. If God actually gave it to him, the discussion's over. Of course, God gave him the courage.
Well, I guess what I mean to say is this.
Who knows if God gave it to him? Yahweh didn't. Jesus didn't. He received it from something else. Was that Jesus? I'd say, nope, it was something else. Something else gave him courage. It wasn't Jesus. But if you're saying Jesus gave him courage, who am I to disagree with you? Of course, then Jesus did it.
Well, I mean, look, if Jesus is God, then anyone who misappropriates some knowledge about God, but really does know God, really does know Jesus, right? I mean, even if they misunderstand or misapprehend, if Jesus is God, then there is no other God who's doling out courage, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would be Jesus, whether or not the person is aware that it's Jesus doing it, right?
In that there's only one God exists, and it is Jesus,
right.
yes.
Right.
But that doesn't preclude any attempt at individuals having wrong structures of faith, belief, trust.
Right. I guess I just mean that, like, you take that example of the guy willing to go walk across the bridge in Selma. I mean, this is the kind of story you hear of, like, people turning to their faith for courage. People of various faiths do this.
Yeah.
I am really reticent to say, well, that's not the real God.
I mean, it's very emotionally resonant to come up with an example of someone who's really loving, but we have plenty of other examples of that sort of love being exhibited by people that have no faith at all. You don't even need a God in the equation. That's a great emotional thing to consider, but it just really isn't an argument. I just understand that if someone does that and they have an experience with God and you're trying to play that against whether it's the same God you experience, I understand the confusion there. But many individuals are capable of doing good things.
It's not that there's no way of explaining his action without God. It's that his action and experience look so similar to my action and experience. Well, not my action. I didn't walk across the bridge in Selma. In fact, my action is much less interesting than his, right? But the praying and the asking for courage and the receiving of courage, I mean, that to me, at least sometimes when I'm thinking about it, just seems so much more immediate than any list of propositions about God. And therefore, I could be more confident in that than any of my beliefs about God.
Yeah, I think maybe a major difference is that I also believe that a relationship with God means you know him as a person. You have this allegiance to him. What you do flows from him and his example. You love others because he loved you, so on and so forth. This is all wrapped up in a very simple conceptualization of God coming from an experience of him. But many individuals can have not just good, virtuous actions, they can even have Christian-looking, self-sacrificial actions. But something would be really weird if you asked them, why are you so self-sacrificial here? Why is it? And when the option is presented, because Jesus has sacrificed himself, so I want to model him, and they reject that model, and they say, no, I'm self-sacrificial because I have such a heart for humanity. They source it in some other, maybe even respectable conviction from secularism.
Yeah.
I'm saying, well, I see the good action, that's fine, I can respect it, but I don't see how this flows from an allegiance and personal relationship with God the way Jesus says such does.
I see what you're saying.
That's why I'm trying to get both. It's not hard. I'm just looking for the consistency there.
Right.
And my job isn't try to figure out who's in and who's out. I'm just saying God has revealed himself this way. This is where he's found.
But interesting on that example, I would say the reason that I believe that human beings have dignity is because of the value that God places on human beings.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't think the other person's belief in inherent dignity was justified or not. It might be totally unjustified. I'm just saying it's flowing from something that isn't Jesus.
But if their belief about human dignity is true, and the reason that their belief is true is because it flows from the Christian story, for instance.
Accidentally true. It's not even knowledge, yeah.
Yep, not even knowledge, but it's true, and their actions as a person flow from that true belief that has its source in the Christian story. I mean, I know that you could say, well, it's just common grace, like everybody has access to that. My gut is like they're fundamentally more connected to God, maybe than your gut is on that situation.
Yeah.
And that's okay that we can have a different sense of that.
I think it just seems odd. Jesus has relationships with people, and he says, if you love me, follow my commandments. If you do, you'll abide in me and I'll abide in you. But after that, it's not as though he says, now everyone, go out to the ends of the earth and just tell people to do things that look like the commandments I told you about. He doesn't say that. He says, go spread my name, and my spirit will be with you, and I'm going to be in relationship with those others just as I am with you. Not religious feeling in general, not just beautiful, virtuous acts. It's the window of faith that looks out on and only on Jesus. It just seems, at least, especially in the Bible, a way through which both you and I think God has spoken to us. That seems to be the case. I'm just trying to draw the lines of consistency between the two. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to. Okay. So I just want to end with 3 final notes. So, I mean, in answer to the question, my answer to the question is, what must one believe to be saved? I have no idea. I think that what one has to do to be saved is to live in trusting faithfulness toward God. And I am pretty radically open to what that looks like. And I'm also open to having that belief change in the future. Maybe I will become more conservative, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
But 3 final notes. Number 1, if universalism is true,
right,
then this is a moot question.
Absolutely.
I lean this way, but I can't prove it. Number 2, if your beliefs about salvation ever lead you in any way to disparage or judge another person, then that's a move backwards away from Christ-likeness. And that is a good reason to question what you believe about salvation.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I also think that knowledge changes over time as our character changes, as we mature. So even if at the beginning of my life, I quote, know something about God's love or about Jesus, I'm going to know it more deeply as time goes and as I mature, as I become more like Christ. So this takes the emphasis off of the binary, I do or I don't believe some proposition. I haven't worked all this out, but it would be interesting to consider how it might affect the types of beliefs that lead to salvation. The best example I could give is sort of this what I keep coming back to, the foundational principle of the universe is self-giving love.
Yeah.
Well, that's something that you could assent to. I could say to you, hey, have you ever thought of it this way? Jesus is God. He's finite. Infinite becomes finite, Check it out. You're like, yeah, I assent to that proposition. But if you talk to an 85-year-old, beautiful old woman or man who has loved people their whole life, and if you were able to get into their mind and their heart and look at the proposition, the center principle of the universe is self-giving love, they know it way more than I know it. And that, I think, is foundational here as well. Anytime we're going to talk about beliefs, we need to recognize that we know beliefs more as we go through time if we are maturing and if they are true. And that doesn't really invalidate anything that you've said necessarily. It's just, I can't leave this discussion without mentioning that it isn't, that beliefs are not just binary for me. It's not just this proposition comes from this proposition comes from this proposition, but really the goal of all of it is to know more deeply over time that Jesus is Lord, or whatever that principle is about the universe that Jesus is Lord means. And the way that we know that more deeply is to practice and to be more like Christ and to love our neighbor and keep loving our neighbor and keep loving our neighbor.
Yeah.
And then our knowledge will become more and more perfect and more effective in changing our behavior and in allowing us to see the world as it really is.
Yeah, I think you and I both agree that we can't look at these propositions of which Christian thought is made up as these mere binary units that are stacked upon each other until the right formation is made.
Right.
But it's more like in the course of getting more information and generating more and more right beliefs, it's like we're adding threads into this tapestry of our knowledge of God and of living with Him. That's more of what it's like.
Yeah.
And of course, that grows richer. The older you grow, the more you know God, and the more you explore these things.
Amen, brother. Dear listener of Reconstruct, you might not realize this, but there are two other places you can find John and myself. You can hear my soothing voice on another podcast. It's called Depolarize. And on that show, it's about politics and psychology and some social questions. And we try and find common ground between the right and the left. And then at profitablediscourse.com, John has essays about theological and philosophical topics, and you can read those and engage with him there. And now we'll go back to our show with John's answer, what must one believe to be saved?
All right, this is an interesting question. I think first we need to understand really the nature of the question and what I think would be an initial answer to it, obviously. But second, we need to address how this question, I think, naturally extends to the deeper question of Christianity amongst other religions and worldviews.
Yeah, that's where it will necessarily go.
Right. Of course, it's reasonable to think that believing something is part of salvation, and that's why this question is stated so understandably. But I actually don't think there's anything anyone believes to be saved, but only something they believe as a result of being saved or in concurrence with being saved. We aren't saved by believing the right thing. We aren't saved by virtue of any of our efforts. Rather, I think we're saved by the grace of God exhibited in the love of Christ. So beliefs emerge as a proper response and effect of this grace.
So just to clear this up, someone will quote the verse, if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved.
Right.
People tend to interpret that as an if-then. If you do this, then the consequence will be that you're saved. You're thinking of it as more like it's a correlation statement. If you are the type of person who believes in your heart and confesses with your mouth, then you're saved. But it's the salvation that happens first, and then the beliefs are a consequence or at the same time as the salvation. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, Paul's primary theological thrust, especially elsewhere, is that our salvation and our being united and reconciled to God first begins with an act of His grace. That's why he just says explicitly elsewhere, it's by grace you have been saved, and not of yourselves. It is the gift of God that we have reconciliation and relationship with Him. Now, he also doesn't mean this is just a mechanical, purely automatic situation that has no human participation. So when he says, when you as a person use your volition to actually confess that Jesus is Lord, that is part of the grace working in you to do that.
But on your view, you're saved before you are capable of making that volitional choice, correct?
Right.
Okay. So go on.
All right. So if that's the case, then moving forward with this question, I think it might be better to ask something like, what sort of beliefs accompany salvation rather than what beliefs are those by which you're saved?
Yeah.
Right. So if salvation belongs finally to God, then what sort of beliefs emerge as a result of this salvation? Well, my argument is that far before either right beliefs or right actions, for that matter, a salvific relationship with God is marked by a genuine trust, commitment, and faithfulness to God. This necessarily comes along with particular beliefs, but relational trust is always the primary aspect. It's the primary response effected by God's grace.
So if we were going to make a hierarchy of the things you would see in someone who was saved, sort of logically prior to any beliefs or actions would be this trust, this sort of state of trust.
Right.
Okay.
But it gets interesting because certain individuals have maintained a salvific relationship with God, but also without a specific belief in Jesus as Lord as we currently understand it. We know this. Abraham, Moses, David,
right.
All the other children of God in the Old Testament, none of them had the specific knowledge of Christ and his death and his resurrection that we do, and none of them believed this. However, they trusted God, and the mark of their trust was an admission of their faults and an appeal to God for help. And through this, they entered a salvific relationship with God in the same way that we have through Jesus. So the point is that while the specific content of their beliefs was different than ours, the object of their belief and trust was the same. It was God.
Okay, so someone might say, well, look, if Abraham could have a relationship with God without knowing about Jesus, why can't someone else? You're saying, well, it's different in the case of the Israelites because Yahweh is the God who comes as Jesus, and it's part of a continuum of the same God acting with different groups of people over time.
Right.
Okay.
The same God from whom Jesus said he came and the same God he worshipped.
Right.
But you brought up a really good point, because if we then move to this category of trust that is logically prior to beliefs, then you're thinking, well, what sort of beliefs could be an expression of this trust? Could it be way more than we think?
Yeah.
But the important point here is that you can't just believe anything so long as you have a trust in God. The beliefs that come along with this trust are never arbitrary. They're never separated from the trust. Instead, take cases like from the Old Testament. Individuals trusted God because they responded appropriately to the way in which he revealed himself to them. So they didn't accidentally trust God, nor did they trust him while considering him to be someone he wasn't. God revealed himself to them, and they trusted him by believing that he was who he revealed himself to be. And the medium of revelation that God previously employed is like the medium of revelation that we currently have. So just as God revealed himself as creator, as Yahweh to the Israelites, so he reveals himself now in Jesus, in his life, and in his work. It is now that God has pointed to Jesus and said, this is who I am, this is what I'm like. That's what people need to believe to have access to the proper object of salvific trust. That's what we mean when we say Jesus is now the way to God.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. So at one time, God revealed himself as Yahweh to the Israelites, but now, since we live after Christ,
right,
our best picture of what God is like is in Jesus.
The one he's given us, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's revealed himself in many ways. That's where the trust first begins. So God has revealed himself, for example, in a burning bush, and someone began a relationship and had trust in him.
Right.
He also reveals himself as Jesus Christ now.
Or someone has a spiritual experience. God says very clearly to them, I exist. And then if they were to say, hey, Dan, John, like, what do I got this voice from God. How do I learn what he's like? We would point them to the Gospels.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, the whole point is that the trust comes as an appropriate response to God's self-revelation. But
Got it.
I'm not saying that there's no chance God reveals himself otherwise to certain individuals, like you just said. It's just that we don't exactly have very good reason to think that he does, because he's revealed himself as Jesus. He's revealed himself decisively in Jesus. So that given what we know, a salvific relationship with God is marked by specific beliefs of who Christ is and what he's like, such that one trusts in him over themselves. And it isn't much to believe at all. I mean, we certainly shouldn't expect salvation to be accompanied by a fully developed theology. Our concern here is simply the formation of right beliefs generated as a result of a right response to God's gracious revelation that establishes this trust in God over oneself.
So you said decisively, God reveals himself decisively in Jesus. And that's the part of your answer that resonates the most with me, is that like the way that I would kind of put it is decisively God has revealed himself to be self-giving and sacrificial in his love toward his creatures. But that's just interesting. I just wanted to note that. Yeah. That's a really interesting word and concept of decisively showing himself.
Right, but that's what I mean when I think God has pointed to Jesus and said, this is who I am, this is what I'm like, so the world can know.
Yeah.
Now, many would be inclined to challenge this. So now we have to consider this in a few different ways. Some argue that mere right belief doesn't amount to salvation because of hypocrisy, namely because there's some individuals who claim to be Christian and assumedly maintain the right belief, and yet they're the furthest thing away from a Christian we can imagine.
Yeah.
So some individuals think right belief must be totally unnecessary to the salvific equation.
Yeah, if there are people who say all the right things, and if you gave them an ideological test, they would pass it as a Christian, but who are obviously awful people, that would sort of point to this idea that, well, belief probably isn't such a big part of this.
Right.
But what's your response to that?
Well, I think the good balance is to realize there is a limitation there in that right belief doesn't get you all the way, but it also isn't totally unnecessary so that it can be discarded. Because think of where we would end up if belief was really unnecessary. Imagine in the inverse. Could wrong belief amount to salvation? Of course it couldn't, inasmuch as that we couldn't have much of a relationship with God if we thought he was Satan or if we thought he was our wife. We could have some wrong beliefs, as we all do, but those wrong beliefs wouldn't amount to salvation. And so we have to remember that the deep trust with which one enters into relationship with God is established in part through the formation of right beliefs, inasmuch as they're generated as a result of a right response to God. But some people can have, apparently, these right beliefs without the deeper trust from which they're supposed to emerge.
In fact, earlier you're saying it's not that salvation is caused by the right belief, but that right beliefs are the result of salvation. And this would line up very well with that experience of hypocrites. You say, look, if right beliefs caused salvation, then we would be forced to believe that all these people who really obviously don't have a relationship with God do, in fact, have one.
Exactly.
But if we say, no, right beliefs come as a result, and someone might still end up with those same beliefs without the prior relationship.
Yes. Yeah, the right beliefs are always there, but you can't always go from them back to the right trust.
So then
they're not a proven indicator, if that makes sense.
But here's the obvious question. When Paul says, if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, then you're saved. That seems to be a pretty strong correlation, not a weak correlation. So would you just say that the combination of believing in your heart and confessing with your mouth in its holistic sort of ancient sense, not a modern sense of belief, would not be the same thing as like a person who could pass an ideological test?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think Paul, in his whole theological context, would affirm that. Okay, so it doesn't seem like it's going to be right belief that amounts to salvation. We have to try something else. And this is why others move to a new argument. Maybe it's right love that amounts to salvation. Maybe that's the new criteria. But yet again, I think we need a balanced view. Think, a virtuous atheist with the right love certainly doesn't have the right faith. They don't have a relationship with God. They've rejected a relationship with God. But on the other hand, take an abused victim or a former oppressor, someone who's come to love Jesus, and in this case, they can certainly be in a relationship with him, but because of their experiences, they can also struggle to love anyone in the right way. So then, I think if it can't be right belief amounts to salvation, right love amounts to salvation, the next thing you can go to is Jesus. is it that relationship? Is it right relationship then that amounts to salvation?
Well, let's go back a second just to hammer that point, because I think there was something deep there and I don't want to skip over it. So you're saying, let's assume for a second that it's right love, but an atheist who loves people very well, in some sort of obvious sense, does not have a relationship with God. If they would say, there is no God, then you would say, well, how's your relationship with that no God, right? That's silly. And then you're talking about like an abuse victim who has just found God's love, but they find it so difficult to love another person that they maybe spend the whole rest of their life struggling to love anybody.
Right.
And so then we would say, well, that person is certainly saved, even though they are doing a really poor job of loving someone because of other circumstances.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure we didn't skip over that. So then what's this third way?
Right. Well, you're getting to something important, because now what we're trying to do is delineate the fact that God has this gracious move into entering into relationship with us, and then we see it emanate in certain ways from us in right belief and right love. The problem is that those two just can't hold all the weight, and they can't just be the thing that amounts to salvation. So where is this participation on the human end of things? And that's why the third option we get to, it's not right belief and that's not right love. What if it is the right relationship? What if it is a relationship with Jesus? And I think, yes, exactly. But also, this is where the balance comes in, that's impossible without some degree of both right beliefs and right love. We have to understand who God has revealed himself to be, and we have to respond appropriately to him. We have to trust him over ourselves. We can't dispose of right beliefs, but we also can't delude ourselves into thinking that right beliefs will get us all the way.
Okay, so why don't you just give us like a good example or an illustration of this?
Yeah, I think there's two really helpful ways for understanding how it must be this equation of trust from which emerges both right belief and right love. Jesus speaks about this in John 15, parabolically. He speaks of branches and of fruit. He speaks of himself as the vine, his Father as the vine dresser. And in this parable, the branches represent believers in Jesus. And so for the sake of our discussion, that can be the category of right belief. And the fruit represents their actions. And so for the sake of our discussion, that can represent right love.
Okay, branches are like a branch being connected to the vine means right beliefs.
Yeah, someone who has assented to the claim that Jesus is Lord.
Who believes Jesus is Lord. And then fruit is love or good actions or whatever.
Right. Now, Jesus is trying to communicate that fruitful branches, apart from the vine, are good with regard to bearing fruit, but they're also transient and unsupported. They'll dry up and they'll be burned.
Basically, without connection to the vine, Christ, loving actions are unsustainable at best.
Right. But on the other hand, fruitless branches that are on the vine are good with regard to being joined to the vine, but since they don't bear fruit, they too will be broken off and taken away. So Jesus here is suggesting that right love, without a union with him, through right belief, is great, but ultimately bankrupt. And also he's saying that union with him through right belief, but without right love, is also great, but it's ultimately inauthentic. So on the one hand, this is like the virtuous atheist, who is to be commended for their right love, obviously, but who also doesn't have a salvific relationship with Christ because of their rejection of right beliefs. And on the other hand, this is like the hypocrite who, though they have the right beliefs, seems like they're the last person in the world that has a salvific relationship with God. Jesus is highlighting for us the fact that salvation doesn't reduce either to love or to belief, but rather is founded upon a unique union of these two as they emerge from a deeper trust in him.
Yeah. So give us another way of thinking about this.
Yeah, I think the other really helpful way of thinking about this is when you look at an argument many people would bring up to this, because many individuals would argue that if one simply has the results of this belief and love without an explicit knowledge of Christ or God, then they're still genuinely loving the real God, and they're accepted by him salvifically. An individual like this, for example, would be inclined to say that the virtuous, humble, self-sacrificing Buddhist is actually worshiping the real God and is saved by him. Now, my response to this is that the line just isn't drawn both ways. and insisting that the Buddhist is in proper relationship with God because they bear the results of a proper relationship with God, ultimately commits the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. So this is the way I understand it. Imagine that from knowing my father, I learned to play music and I now compose songs. It simply doesn't follow that anyone who composes songs therefore knows my father. They could have learned music from anyone.
Right.
Similarly, the virtuous or seemingly Christian actions that the Buddhist exhibits can have totally different sources. I mean, Christian-like actions could come from sincerity, it could come from manipulation, it could come from Buddhism, it could come from secularism, or it could come from Christianity. And this, I argue, is why Jesus cares so much about a personal, intimate relationship with those who follow him. Obviously, those who live humble, virtuous lives are tapping into what God sees as good. But to say that they therefore know God salvifically simply strips him of his intimate, dramatic, covenantal personhood by which he enters into relationship. It ends up making him just some general force that is somehow unwittingly trickled into people who do certain things. Because the point isn't to play music and, thus partaking in the general force of sonic harmony, come to unwittingly know my father, who is now just some force instead of a real person. Rather, it's to know my father than to go forth, compose music, and fill the world with harmony on his behalf. It's about having a relationship with God through Christ and then living a life founded upon that relationship. That's my alternate account.
Okay, so let's keep following this line of thinking specifically to people of other faiths or atheists or whatever.
Right. The question naturally extends into the question of whether or not individuals who do not know or believe in Christ nevertheless have a salvific relationship with him. So those who affirm that one can have a relationship with God without believing in him obviously move the decisive factor of salvation away from knowledge and belief and towards the trust and commitment we've been talking about. The Buddhist might not believe in Christ, some argue, but he can certainly trust Christ. Now, I think there are a few problems with this.
Yeah, that would be the obvious move. Let's hear what your problems are.
All right, first, it's almost inconceivable that relational trust can be established without knowledge of the person involved in the relationship. It just simply makes no sense. This is why individuals usually argue that the Buddhist is trusting God on the basis of the best and most complete idea of God they can produce, to account for the fact they don't know much. But this is irrelevant to the discussion, because the issue at hand is not how much someone knows about Jesus or God, but rather that they know Jesus and God. We're not discussing the extent of knowledge, but the object of knowledge. And the object of knowledge in the case of the Buddhist is simply not Jesus. Someone could even believe in another God with a more developed conceptualization than that with which a Christian believes in their God. But that doesn't make the false God the true God. Trusting in God comes as a response to God's revelation, and God specifically does not reveal himself as the gods of other religions. Instead, he reveals himself as Jesus and as standing in the greatest possible contrast to other religions.
Okay, so John, on your view, again, the first move in all of this is the real God,
right,
revealing himself through Scripture in covenant with his people, first as Yahweh to the Jews, and then as Jesus to Christians and the rest of the world.
Yep.
And really most clearly revealing himself in the person and actions of Christ.
Yeah.
And for you, any claim to know God outside of that story is going to be false. Why?
Any claim to know God in a story that is contradictory to that story will be false, which is just obvious by a case of identity.
What constitutes contradiction? Like, for instance, a Muslim saying God cannot be a Trinity. He can only be one. Therefore, Jesus can't be God. He can only be
if someone says
else.
They worship God and they say Jesus is not God, and they say the God in Scripture is not God, and instead of naming those people as God, they name somebody else, that's a different story. And of course, if you just have any respect that things mean things, you're not going to say that's Christianity and that's the Christian God.
Well, it's definitely not Christianity, but you can... Man, it's really hard for me to not argue with you during your answer, but I'll just note this one thing, that it depends on how much confidence you have in language, right? Because you could still say, yeah, they're not identifying the same religion when they say that, but those identifiers in all of us may be deficient enough that it doesn't keep them from relationship. You'd at least admit that's possible.
The problem, though, is that on that view, the limitedness of language would bear just as harsh a critique against the conclusion you just mentioned.
Possibly.
You'd have to question it just as hard.
Yeah, well,
so either the view that Christianity is true or all of them are much more open or available as we think, both of those are restricted by the limitedness of language, and we have just as little reason to affirm the one as we do the other.
Maybe. We'll have to save that for another time.
But I do have another problem.
Yeah, so there's another problem here, too. Let's hear it.
Now, if someone still wants to argue that the Buddhist is nonetheless worshiping the real God and is saved by him, then they simply end up establishing a different and imperialistic system.
Ooh, imperialistic.
An imperialistic system that actually does violence to the beliefs and convictions of those of other worldviews and faiths. This is what I mean. We can't just declare that Buddhists or atheists are unwittingly loving the Christian God. They're Buddhists, they're atheists. They understand who the Christian God is, and they do not want to worship him. And to say otherwise is both offensive and disrespectful. We can't do it. Basically, in the honorable name, I think, of extending God's salvation as far as possible, a view like this just unfortunately ends up obliterating the reality and distinctiveness of the other. And it just usurps them into a narrative, the Christian narrative, which is one to which they would never ascribe. We can say the Buddhist or the Muslim is really worshiping the Christian God, but they know who Jesus is. And they know what he stands for, maybe even more than we do. And they don't worship him as God. In fact, they could turn it around. They could say, we're really following Buddhism, though we assent to the Christian God. But of course, this would be odd, offensive, and disrespectful. We aren't Buddhists, we're Christians.
So you're saying that it's imperialistic, like Britain was imperialistic, to say, well, I know you guys are from India, but you're all British subjects. Like, I know you're Buddhists and you're Muslims, but like, really, you're just bad Christians. There's something sort of inherently offensive and deriding about that, and it's actually not respecting their own traditions and their own belief systems.
Yeah. Is disregarding the distinctiveness of another as the other and just saying, no, they're part of my worldview. I'm really the right one, and everyone fits into my view of things. I'm not going to let the other be the other. I'll just usurp them into my view.
Although, to be fair, either way, we are still going to have to say that our belief system is right. We're just, what we're discussing is if we're going to usurp them into ours or not. Oh,
it's perfectly reasonable to think that your account of ultimate reality is right. That's fine. That's what interreligious dialogue is about.
Right. And you really can't believe that your account of ultimate reality is wrong, then you wouldn't believe it.
Exactly. Right.
Okay, so move on.
My point is that if we're going to be charitable with others, we just need to actually let them be who they are. But there is a way to escape this charge and to maintain that the adherents of different worldviews and religions are actually trusting the real God.
What's that way?
The only way you can really do it is if you conclude that Jesus, Allah, the structure or presuppositions of secularism, or any other ground of any other worldview, is not actually Jesus, the Trinity, but it's some different presentation of an altogether different God, who is somehow above them all, who presents himself as Jesus sometimes, as Allah sometimes, or in some other way that we can't even name right now, to some other adherents of another worldview.
Yeah.
But of course, this can only be consistently maintained if Christianity is denied. Jesus, the Father, the Holy Spirit comprise the personal, specific, covenanting Trinitarian God, not some pantheistic divine force that presents itself as anything to anyone.
Yeah,
so
really
there is a way to escape it, but it can't be Christianity. It has to be another worldview.
Or it would have to be some other worldview that said all religions get at some truth about God, and maybe some do it better than others, but Christianity does by far the best job, as far as I can tell, or something like that. You could maybe say.
Right. The justification there would probably still be cultural and circumstantial. It might say, for us modern Westerns, Christianity is the presentation of this God that works best with us. In 1,000 years, it might be someone else.
Yeah, you might want to go some way like that. This is another interesting time to bring up like possible aliens or like people on other planets with totally different civilizations and different language and who wouldn't have had Jesus of Nazareth. It's interesting to think about how might God communicate his love to them? I mean, that's a mind bender.
Or just communicate himself.
Yeah, whatever. But I guess I'm just saying God communicating God's self is always love because God is love. So.
Okay, so if that's the case, how do we deal with the problem? How is it that some people know God and some people do not know God, though there can be this striking similarity between Christianity and other worldviews and faiths, between their visions of morality and of the good life? I think that because humanity is made by God in the image of God, this similarity should actually be no cause for surprise, because the whole of humanity grasps after the divine in ways which mirror the truth.
Yeah, we all have some sense of love and service and what God is like. And so we all look toward it. But your claim is that, and I would agree with this, is that Christianity uniquely explains the reality behind that universal grasping for truth.
Right, and we Christians also grasp after the divine in ways that only mirror the truth all the time. Because of sin, because of our brokenness, humanity's desires are just wrongly ordered. Our value systems are off course. We're prone to produce idols, to treat as ultimate something other than God. The difficulty is that, seeing that Christianity and other religions might bear a similarity, we have to resist making the unwarranted jump from similarity to fundamental identity. And this is why theologian N.T. Wright has argued that the religions of the world, seeing God's reflection in the mirror of creation, worship the mirror instead of the one there reflected. Of course, Christians are inclined to do this very thing, and it is only by the grace of God that we've been saved by and directed towards that which the mirror reflects. Wright is tapping into a central theological conviction that aside from the grace of God, humans are inclined to make gods for themselves, and that only by the grace of God is our worship rightly directed and faithfully carried out.
So one thing that we agree on here is something like all humans sin. We have a very hard or impossible time seeing the world as it really is, and that everything good in the universe is reliant on God's grace. It just feels good to note some moment of agreement in the midst of all this. So
yeah, absolutely.
Let's get back to N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright has a really good quote on this, an extended argument that does a really good job of encapsulating what I believe.
You want to read it verbatim. You want to read the whole thing, don't you?
I'm going to read the whole thing.
You're just going to read the whole thing.
Whole extended quote.
Okay, here it is. Get some popcorn.
All right, this is what he says. Quote, "In the New Testament, faith is never a religious feeling in general, nor simply that which all men know in their hearts. It is never by itself self-authenticating. Faith in the New Testament is a window which exists simply for the sake of what is seen through it. And the window of Christian faith looks out on and only on Jesus Christ. We may still hope that in the mercy of God there are those, whether many or few, who do in fact follow the highest they know, and who, acknowledging their failure to keep the standards they have, trust in a power beyond themselves to save and defend, and who will at last recognize Jesus as the one whom they had ignorantly worshipped. It may be that such a possibility exists, but we have no warrant for a dogmatic assertion that it must."
End quote.
That is really the balance I think we need to hold together. Of course, some who don't believe in Jesus can be saved, given that God has graciously revealed himself to them in some other way and that they have responded appropriately. But also, I just don't think we can insist that those who don't believe in Jesus must be saved. The theologian and missionary Leslie Newbigin summarizes this really well. Basically, his argument is that we need to affirm the unique truth of the revelation in Jesus Christ, and yet also not deny the possibility of salvation to the non-Christian. We need to affirm that God's saving grace might possibly extend beyond those of Christian profession, and yet we have to deny that all other faiths follow Christ or can be vehicles of salvation. We need to affirm the readily apparent gracious work of God in the lives of all human beings, and yet still affirm the decidedness of what he has done in Christ. In my opinion, that's just the most serious theological position I found.
So, you have this quote. You said, "I'm not saying there's no chance that God reveals himself otherwise to certain individuals. It's just that we have no good reason to think that he does." You said something to that effect.
Sure.
I don't think that we have no reason. I think that your language is too strong there. The fact that God revealed himself to Abraham and then to Moses and the Israelites shows that an incomplete and imperfect representation of God still is sufficient for a life of faith. Why close that off from other incomplete understandings?
I actually agree with you. I mean, I don't know if I would say that God's self-revelation to the Israelites was completely imperfect or incomplete, but I'd agree with it for the sake of discussion. The point, though, goes back to an original argument I had in the way I see things. A trust in God isn't established on the extent of your knowledge of him. It's on the object of your knowledge. Incomplete? That's great. That's fine.
As long as it's the right object.
God, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, imagine like knowing my father when I'm like 6 years old, right? I can actually know who he is. Do I know much of him? Man, compared to my mother's knowledge of him, I know nothing. But I do know who he is. I know that my father isn't the neighbor across the street. I know that he isn't a stranger in the store. My father is my father. It's not much, but it's perfectly sufficient for a relationship with him.
Okay, but let's go back. Let's talk about the Israelites. So what you're saying is when the Israelites are living in Israel or beforehand, the real God communicates to Moses. Now, if there is a man who worships Baal or Ra or whatever, you're saying that there's no way it's the real God communicating to that holy man. It's only the Israelite prophet that hears the real voice of God. Is that what you're saying?
If we're saying that Yahweh and Baal are two different gods, I agree.
Well, I mean, obviously we're saying they're different gods. Are we saying that just because they're different gods, that no prophet of Baal could categorically ever hear the voice of the real God unless he was first corrected by saying, it's Yahweh, it's not Baal?
If that prophet of Baal received God's self-revelation and then responded appropriately to it, then he would be in a relationship with God. His worship of Baal demonstrates that he hasn't.
But would he know that it was Yahweh if that were the case? Is the self-identification of God as Yahweh or the self-identification of God as Jesus necessary to any self-revelation of God?
Now I see what you're saying. God reveals himself as who he is, not who he isn't. He doesn't reveal himself as Baal. So a prophet who says, I know God, it's Baal, has not responded appropriately to the God of Moses.
Yeah, I don't agree.
He doesn't reveal himself as someone who he isn't. Simple.
Let's say there's a person. Okay, so let's move to our current day.
Yeah.
There is a person who lives in India, and he has been raised with Hindu imagery his whole life. He has a spiritual experience, let's just say for the sake of argument, of the real God. I just think it is likely that the imagery he will associate with that real God is Hindu imagery, because he just doesn't even have the language complex to go, I've been raised as a Hindu for 30 years and boom, oh, this is Jesus of Nazareth. I think that it is presumptuous to assume that that person would have that kind of language attached to that experience of God.
I definitely don't think people are that restricted. We have no problem understanding a different pattern between Hinduism and 30 other religions and different other worldviews. Someone who just lives in India doesn't make them cognitively handicapped to the extent that their imagination is, I don't know, endless floors beneath ours. I think it's perfectly possible that their structures of who they thought God was could be subverted by the real God. I don't even think it's a problem for God to actually graciously give him that capacity.
I'm not disagreeing with that. What I think your argument is that he would necessarily have to disabuse them of false notions to be an experience of the real God. That's what I have a problem with. He very well may disabuse a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim of false notions if he so chooses, but I don't see a way that we can say he necessarily has to. That's the part I have a problem with, just to be clear.
Yeah. The conclusion that I'm trying to delineate away from is that if God revealed himself to him and he responded appropriately and he had a relationship with the real God, the God that we know reveals himself as Jesus and not as the intricate structure of Hindu thought, if this individual said, I know the real God, and pointed towards the structure of Hindu thought, which is not God, we'd have a very confusing scenario. And we have no reason to believe that someone would do that. Well, they know who God is. They would call him who he is.
Okay, but here's one set of affairs. God is breaking through the calcified systems of every religious person in the world and tries to get to the core of those people and have an intimate, loving relationship with them. If you were to believe that premise, it doesn't seem like it's so hard to get there.
I'm wondering if we disagree here.
Maybe we don't.
I just say because I don't see incompleteness or even a view that also is filled with a lot of skepticism and doubt as one that precludes knowing the real God. It doesn't need to be very thorough.
And I agree. So where I get tripped up is, but then it seems like you need this kind of elaborate scaffolding of like, but this is the way God reveals himself through these terms. But the concepts and the terms, Trinitarianism or monotheism or whatever, I'm not that confident that that's the real important stuff. It seems like if you as a 6-year-old can know your father and I as a 6-year-old can know the real God of the universe, I don't know.
Yeah, that's why I highlighted the decisiveness of Jesus Christ. What we know, for all we know, God reveals himself as Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I believe that that's true.
Right. So I'm just saying, if someone says, I know the real God, he's Allah, that cannot be where God is.
No, it's not that it...
I mean, you're talking about Trinitarianism and monotheism. There's Christians that don't believe that. They believe in modalism, not Trinitarianism.
Right.
But they're there with Jesus Christ. They know who he is. If you go to somebody who is not God and you name him as God, if we have any respect that things mean things, we can't say that person knows the real God.
No, I don't agree with that. And here's why. Because if we're thinking about language, okay, let's break down what we mean by this. So I have an atheist friend. That atheist friend is named Stephanie, let's just say. Stephanie was raised in the church. She left it in college. Nonetheless, Stephanie is haunted by the idea that like the world is full of meaning. She just doesn't think that the Christian church gets it because she has, let's just say for the sake of argument, good reason to think that given her church background, that's not where it is, right? I don't think that we can say, oh, she definitely doesn't have a relationship with God because she doesn't think God exists. She might just in her rubric of language not be able to affirm Jesus is Lord. Do you see what I'm saying? Let's say she had good reasons that led her to a linguistic statement that we would say is false. But the heart of where she's coming from may not be false, depending on who she is, and we can't really judge that.
Yeah, the only heart you get there, though, is a willingness for meaning to be in the world, and that's not the person of Jesus Christ. Let's
say she actively loves her neighbor indefatigably as herself and digs wells in Africa. I mean,
right.
I don't...
But an exemplification of a life that looks like Christian life can only be affirmed to actually be the result of a relationship with God if you commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent.
Okay, so let's move into my critique of your...
I have another example.
Okay.
This might be good, too.
Okay.
I mean, this is really the problem we're dealing with. But if you go to someone who's a Muslim and you're trying to determine whether or not they actually love Jesus, love the real God, but they give to this God, the one we worship, the name Allah, and you speak to them and you say, here's Jesus, the one I worship. What do you think of him? You describe Jesus to him. And they say, I know exactly who that is. That isn't God. I don't worship him. You go forward, explain the rest of the Trinity. And they're like, no. God is not like that at all. This is what God is like. They point to Allah. They describe him with more eloquence than you do Jesus. They say, that is God, not Jesus. I'm saying at that point, if you want to say the Muslim is worshiping Jesus, we've given up all semblance that things mean things. At some point, we actually have to respect that God might have revealed himself, and this person is not having it. They worship some other thing. In other words, I could also even admit the spiritual experience of Stephanie the atheist, but she could also just reject it. She could just not respond appropriately. That's very possible. It's also even more possible that God could overcome her sociological experiences and show himself to her. He's God, for heaven's sake.
Okay, those are fair points. Let's move on.
Yeah.
With the example of Jesus and the vine and the branches, we know the fruit is right action or loving action.
Right.
We know that the branches are belief or right belief or whatever. And we know that Jesus is the vine. But why does connection to the vine by the branch need to mean right belief or assent to belief that Jesus is the vine? Why can't it simply mean connection to the vine? The vine being the self-giving love of God as shown in Christ. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm definitely taking Jesus' parable and making it apply to our discussion.
Yeah.
These things are now, they've become heuristic categories rather than a full, actual, accurate depiction of everything.
What does heuristic mean?
It means educational.
Okay.
Basically for the sake of making sense of our discussion and seeing what Jesus has to say about a topic like this. The branches in his parable are individuals that are connected to him, that have that trusting relationship, right? I'm saying for our discussion, those individuals to whom he's referring are ones that go to him, know him, and say, you're not just a normal Nazarene, you're the Messiah. They have that confession, right? So that's why I'm saying, heuristically, we can just say, the branches here are people that confess Jesus. And we can say, that could be right belief. But he's saying there's a situation in which you have this right confession, but you don't bear fruit. That's like the hypocrite.
Sure,
See
I guess
it just works with our discussion.
It's going to keep coming down to language, though. I mean, like, there are a lot of people in the world who know that Jesus is God.
Yeah.
But Jean Vanier, who runs large communities for disabled people, knows that Jesus is God way more than I know that Jesus is God.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to say that when it comes to salvation or when it comes to these things, who's in, who's out, I'm a little bit afraid of making it a binary.
Wait, what about Vanier?
What I mean is, if we're going to say there's two teams, there's in and there's out, and the ones who are in because they have a relationship with the real God, and the way that we know they have a relationship with the real God is that they identify him as Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
Okay. That means Vanier and I are on totally equal footing when it comes to being on that team. But there might be someone who loves people so well and understands so much better than I do the true nature of the heart of Christ, that the center of the universe is self-giving love.
Right.
That person is not on the team because if we were to ask them about what they believe about the world, they would not include the words Jesus of Nazareth being God.
But you're already, even when you sub the word Jesus Christ, the person of Jesus Christ, for a general force of self-giving love at the center of reality, you are very far away from this personal individual that covenants with people. I'm just saying. I
understand what you're saying.
I'm not accusing you of this. It gets just to pantheism.
I don't know that it gets to pantheism, but maybe.
You can say Jesus is the source of self-giving love at the center of reality, but isn't just some disembodied source. It's Jesus.
I agree with, that is what I would say, but I would say it in such a way that it's like, what we learn about God through Jesus is that the center of the universe is self-sacrificial love. What I'm rejecting, or what I am very nervous about saying, is that someone's identification of that proposition that I just said is so incredibly related to their salvation.
And what I'm saying is that people know the individuals with whom they have a relationship. It doesn't need to be this analytical, philosophical proposition that they must assent to or must not assent to. It's just that if I know my dad, I know my dad. And if I say, that's not my dad, this stranger over here across the street, that's my dad,
right?
You'd question whether I know him or not. Not because of this weird structure imposed upon all cognitive faculties that must assent to a proposition. It's just, if you know a person, you know a person. I'm looking at it much more simplistic, I think.
Okay. So moving on, one of the things you said earlier is because the issue at hand is not how much someone knows about Jesus and God, but rather that they know Jesus and God.
Yeah.
We're not discussing the extent of knowledge, but the object of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? But I think this breaks down because really the only way we can delineate who the object is, quote, of the knowledge is through analyzing people's beliefs. So say you have a Christian and a Buddhist who are like equally religious and spend the same amount of time in prayer and do the same good works and have the same love of neighbor. Okay.
Right.
The only difference between them is what they believe God is like, because it's hard to say that, well, the Buddhist doesn't have a relationship because he's not praying to the Christian God. It's like, For a Buddhist, it's like, it's meditation, it's silence, it's sort of communing with the one. But if it produces the exact same fruit in their life, the only difference is their beliefs. So how can we talk about it's not beliefs, it's the object, if the only way of defining who the object is through beliefs?
Well, one way of understanding this is that the actions and the beliefs all come in unification with the trust. So they're never really separated. So of course, those can be indicators. In fact, the way they live their life with regard to right love will most likely look really, really different as well, especially their reasons and motivations. One might say, I'm doing this because I follow Jesus. That's why I love other people. He told me to. The Buddhist is not going to say that. They do good, virtuous actions for a totally different reason. But if you go to the Buddhist, this is basically what I'm trying to protect against for the sake of consistency of knowing God to be who he is. And we say, supposing perhaps that this Buddhist knows the real Christian God, who is God to you? For example, I think Jesus is God. Let me explain him to you. And the Buddhist, though he has a very virtuous life that looks like the Christian, says, oh, Jesus? No, that isn't God. He said some pretty good things. I respect him. But no, he's not God. The one is God. At that point, if you want to say that person has a relationship with God, I don't know how you think words mean things anymore. It's completely different. At that point, I would just respect his decision that he knows what he's talking about.
I think you respect it, but I don't know that that's a hard one.
And also, what we know about God is that he reveals himself as he is. It's not about us trying to break through the wall and get to the right knowledge of God. He shows himself who he is, and he enters into a personal relationship by grace.
So there's a bit of a distinction. I would say that I know who God is more because of my direct experience of him than the linguistic framework that that experience is placed within. I think if I had to say. And so maybe that is where our intuition here is a little different. But if someone else is experiencing that same thing that I'm experiencing, but they have different language for it, I'm just like very nervous about saying that that's not God.
Right. And that's where you and I both get to a point of agreement in that it could be a case-by-case basis of understanding what's going on here.
This is like where we totally agree.
There's totally a chance, I think, that God could reveal himself, and at some point in the individual's transition to entering into this personal relationship and making it part of their life, they're convinced of the experience and who this God is, but they haven't yet been able to give a name to it or something. Or that he could maybe possibly reveal himself in another way.
Why can't they just say, this is the name that has been given to me, and wow, I didn't think Allah would be quite this beautiful or would be quite this extravagant.
Certainly
in his
he
giving
could,
of
but he'd
joy,
be giving
but
a definition
is.
of Allah that no Muslim would assent to.
I mean, I don't know. The Sufis
Jesus is a little bit different than Allah.
No,
so if he's describing Jesus and use the word Allah, any normally intelligent person is going to know that isn't Allah. It doesn't conform at all.
No,
in the same way that we don't
dude.
say, you can't take who Jesus is and say, that's Allah, and blend the two conceptions together.
I know you can't do that. I'm just saying, like a Sufi Muslim, the contemplative tradition in Islam, they describe experiences with God that are very similar to a lot of experiences that Christian mystics have. How can we be confident that they're not experiencing the same God just because their religious linguistic framework is different?
I'm not trying to demarcate lines or criteria by which we judge who's in and out.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to say, this is who God is. This is how he works. This is how he reveals himself. If someone points to that God and says, nope, that isn't God, I think a totally different, contrasting, contradictory conception of God is God, then I have to just respect that things mean things and say, they probably don't know that God, who they absolutely reject and say is replaced by a different God. That's not to speak of genuine spiritual experiences. Maybe that comes down to the factor of appropriate and inappropriate response. I don't know, but it doesn't really factor into what I'm trying to do, if that makes sense.
So you're not really addressing so much people's direct experience of God. You're more trying to address the way people describe the God that they believe in or don't believe in.
Yeah, and it's a situation in which I think we'd both agree it's hard to make blanket statements about it at all. We'd have to just know the individual's case by case. I'm definitely not saying all good Buddhists are saved, all good Muslims are saved. I'm not saying there's sort of like an equal mechanism in every religion,
I'm just very nervous about saying that huge swaths of entire groups of people cannot have access to the real God because of the propositions that they believe or don't believe about him.
Yeah, I'm not saying that either. Yeah.
Right. So earlier you said something to the extent of how it's like inconceivable that relational trust can come without knowledge of the person involved in the relationship, right?
Yeah.
I know this applies to people for sure, but I don't know that it applies to God. So like, whereas with my wife, I would say, you know, I know 60 to 70% of like everything that Jaffrey is. I don't have everything. I don't know her completely, but like I have a pretty good handle on who she is. But if you say, Dan, what percentage of God do you think you can comprehend? I would say 2%, 3%. Like my interaction with God is that he is fundamentally other. The only thing I can know about God is what he chooses to reveal to me, right? And we would agree.
We agree.
Now, the question then is, how exhaustive and accurate are those types of revelation of God that can be communicated through language? And this is, I think, where we break off. So for me, I want to say the immediate love or joy or whatever that God gives me is more foundational than the system of knowledge that I can get through assessing scripture.
Yeah.
And so there's a different order there. It's not the same as you could then, in my opinion, know the real God with very little understanding of who it is.
Right.
Unlike your father or your wife or something like that.
I see your position, but I'm actually not too far away.
Okay.
In other words, this comes back to the extent over object distinction.
Yeah.
You know 70% of your wife, and that comes out of your relational trust with her, right? And you only know 2% of God, though you know you have a personal relationship of trust with him.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, first, you might know more than just 2%. But if all you know is 2, great. It goes back to my analogy of when I'm 6 years old and I know my father. How much do I know of him? Nothing. Compared to my mother, nothing.
Right.
0.5%.
Right.
That's fine.
Okay.
I don't need to know his story and his ontology. I just know he's my father, and that's the basis of the relational trust.
But I think if you just like, if there's a woman pushing a stroller with a headscarf on, you know, and you just had coffee with her and asked her what she believes about God, I just don't think you're going to get as big of a difference. And maybe that's wishful thinking, or maybe that's sort of like bleeding heart liberalism or something like that. It could be.
It is definitely your inclination. Yeah. Like a few times today already, you've gone away from Jesus' narrative and you keep saying the center of the universe is self-giving love.
Yeah.
And that is just not normal Christian narrative stuff. That's someone who totally has no sympathy for Christianity could be a pantheist and believe that, or a deist 1,000 years ago and believe that. So I'm saying we're getting into the not overly exhaustive, but personal specificity of God.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, please go to iTunes, subscribe to our podcast, and leave a review. It only takes a minute to fill out a review and submit it, and it really helps us out as a new show.
And check in next week for the story of Science Mike McHarg's Deconstruction and Reconstruction. He's an author, he's a host of Ask Science Mike podcast, as well as co-host of The Liturgists. And we really loved that conversation with him. We're excited to play it for you. See you next week.